I just want to say thanks for everyone for stopping in. I think we'll get going. We're starting a few minutes late, but we'll try to wrap up on time to get you back on schedule. But this is the small business cyber liability session. We're going to try to focus as much on the small business aspect and kind of the differences between small and large as possible. Just to go through the panel. So I'm Brian Thornton. We've got Glenn Manjos here from RSUI, Steve Malone from Worldwide Facilities, Inc., Dom Paluzzi from McDonald Hopkins, Emily Cummins from the NRA, Jeremy Henley from ID Experts. And so we've really got a panel to round it out to kind of present all the different points of view. So we've got underwriting, brokerage, a client, the claims side, as well as the service provider. And so with that, we're going to kick it off. We're not going to go line by line through PowerPoint. We want to kind of make this as open as possible. So if there's any questions. How's that?
It's on.
Okay. Sorry about that. Any other questions related to small business cyber? Okay, well, we'll get going. And so one of the first things I thought we'd kind of touch on as far as from the client perspective, Emily, if you could touch on kind of the prospect when you first looked at buying cyber and some of the obstacles as well.
Thank you. And I do appreciate each of you here in the audience. I respect you individually and our likely differences of opinion regarding my organization, our mission, and our goals. And I say that up front because I want you to know I do respect our differences. But with that said, I was asked to provide practical information for those of you on the sell side through insight into our own cyber buy. I know when people hear the NRA, they either want to hug me or slug me. And I had to clean up that rhyme because I was told no swears today. A, I'm not here to make friends, but B, I actually am here to make friends at Net Diligence. I am supposed to be continuing to build our corporate partnerships and how much I appreciate our existing cyber underwriters and my lawyers. 4 of the law firms that work with me and the NRA are at this conference, including Louis Brisbois, fantastic, I can't say enough about them. I almost am reluctant to compliment Louis Brisbois here because a public remark from the NRA can be difficult for an organization, but at a conference like this, you all know, it's not about ideology, it's about having the most informed possible buyer. Now, a sophisticated audience like this knows why I can't go too specific as to exact cyber premiums paid or total cyber limits available. I verify we're a long-time cyber buyer and we're loyal. Expecting me to give you that kind of specific intel would be inside information about the NRA. And that's like asking a woman exactly how many guns she owns. You don't ask that, right? I verify we're a long-time loyal cyber buyer because the critical importance of long-term loyalty in cyber is that it's not an annual transaction. It's a long-term relationship that should be productive for everyone. If it would be just an annual insurance buy, then it's been commoditized. And we all know cyber's not anywhere close to that yet, right? For us, the biggest factor was a trusted broker. Now, normally I don't specifically identify our broker or publicize them, but our organization has a lot of extreme highs and lows. And in the good times, at conferences like this, people always want to talk to me. And in the bad times when our reputation suffers, people avoid me like the plague, leave me hateful voicemails and emails, and so forth. And so, because I should celebrate Lockton, they've done a fantastic job for the NRA. And for my career, I wouldn't be here in cyber without Lockton. Here is how Lockton really stood out. Ben Beeson for the win. Ben was able to work with our internal stakeholders to move them toward the right position of making that mental commitment of the new buy. Once you start buying cyber, you need to keep buying it in perpetuity. That was all about the educational process. And new entrants into the cyber buying, we need education, encouragement, training, then more continuing education because this is such a technical specialty, right? You need to keep coming back to conferences like this. It never felt sales pitchy at all. And that process worked smoothly for us. It was quite remarkable that in the first session this morning, 3 of the 4 insurers on that panel were very critical of buyers and risk managers. 3 of the 4 said that we were ignorant, ill-informed, didn't know our own coverages, didn't know why to buy. Remember that, you're talking about the buyers that are trying to do the right thing. And so, especially in a conference like this, your clients and prospective clients are in the audience. We're here to gain continuing education, to know what we're buying, to know why, right? And when you do a good job for us, then we compliment you in front of everybody else, like with Lockton and Lewis Brisbois, right?
And when you were first buying the coverage, what was when you were pushing to buy the coverage as the first time kind of buyer, what was some of the reaction internally or some of the resistance you were kind of facing?
Well, our key cyber risks are the fact that we're a 5 million member association with PII on 5 million members and recently expired members, so that's another 2 million people. Also, corporate IP. And so the cyber risks were quite clear and apparent. We didn't actually have resistance or pushback. I simply had to include it in my budget and get the board to approve that budget.
Gotcha. And then Steve, just as a kind of, you see a lot of kind of small cyber stuff and we've been doing it for a while, just be curious kind of your point of view within the small space, some of the challenges with some of the first time buyers.
Yeah, it's an especially challenging space because they don't have as much resources allocated to risk management. It's typically the CFO doing it because it's a budget item, and the CFO knows little to no about the actual cyber and privacy issues within an organization. And also within small companies, you have people wearing multiple hats, so there's not this kind of hierarchy of reporting structure. So you have, you present it to the CFO and he bounces it around and then they kind of come to a decision. It's not quite as informed as it is in a large organization. So it's especially challenging to educate them throughout the whole process.
And as you're kind of talking to some of the smaller businesses that you're selling this to, what are you seeing as far as changes in the market with some of the carriers and how they're approaching small business versus large?
It changes each year. Every year we go to this plus, annual conference and we'll see a lot of the same faces, and everybody has figured out a new way to approach small business. And it's kind of a one-size-fits-all, quote-to-bind kind of approach. And it's kind of the opposite of the approach that we have to take as brokers, because we have to treat their risk the same as we would a larger organization, or we have to, do some analysis internally within their apps and on their websites and in discussions with them to figure out their exposures and tailor, an insurance program to their needs. Typically, the carrier and the underwriter want to just throw something at you as quick as possible and hope that it binds because it's a volume play for them. So we as brokers really need to slow down the process and ask more questions than the underwriters are. As most of the underwriters, they have a stack of submissions in front of them and they have a lunch break that they want to get to, and the reality is that you want to try and, act as a check and a balance between what the needs are of the insured and what the workflows are these underwriters.
I think it's talking from the underwriting side, I think that actually stresses the importance of the broker and the agent in that process with the actual client and the buyer. I found from going from looking at more large company business to moving to middle market and small that you have to redefine kind of how you underwrite those businesses and those accounts. You're not going to get full submissions or conference calls, and you're not going to get a copy of the most recent, HIPAA audit that they had, or Booz Allen audit. That's the plug for you. So for us, we have to really identify it by industry and kind of bring it back and saying, who is this customer touching? Because a lot of times we don't have very good brokers that are, not that there aren't always very good brokers, but sometimes we'll just get a one-page app, a 5-page thing, or a website and a D&O application saying, I need to present cyber. So when we come into that situation, what we have to do is kind of look at that and see who is the client touching, where's their exposure? Are they consumer direct? No. Okay, so then kind of peel those layers back and see if they have an incident, if they have a breach, is it going to be a ripple effect, or is it going to be like a tsunami or a rogue wave that kind of hits all these other people that they touch? And it's not just who they touch as a customer, but then you got to think about who their vendors are and what type of relationship that they have there and who their vendors are and how important they place their security.
And that was actually something that Mark started to touch on in the previous session as far as like the cloud. And when you're seeing that on some of the small business submissions, are you seeing, a trend as far as more and more outsourcing to cloud providers? And then how are you kind of approaching that?
It's difficult because again, you're not seeing, especially in small business, I think one of the biggest factors that is driving a lot of the coverage buying now is also the contract. You used to have it where the small business is going in for a contract and they're trying to get it and they can't negotiate the terms and conditions with their customers, especially if they're dealing with a large company, they want that account. It used to be that they were just requiring for professional liability or some type of E&O, and that was pretty readily available and something they can understand and get their hands around. But now they're getting stuff where they're, with these big companies that throwing cyber in there, or, cyber security or privacy coverage. They don't know what that means. And then it's coming back to really the broker to identify in this world of, there's probably 50 different primary markets, maybe more, that are actually writing it, to identify if this coverage is actually doing its job and meeting the contractual requirements. Unfortunately, a lot of the buyers just see that it says cyber and they have a cyber policy and they don't care that it's $50,000 supplement. On the reverse side is that, those same small businesses, I think they don't have the exposure because they're outsourcing it. So they're saying that they're using some type of cloud provider or SaaS provider that's doing their back office or their logistics, and they feel that they're safe. The problem is that they look at those SLAs, those requirements in those contracts, they're actually only going to get service credits in return if there is an outage or something happens. So in that time, the buck really stops with that small business and that middle market business. And if they don't have the resources to access a forensics firm or a lawyer, they're kind of, the doors will be shut.
And what are you seeing? Are you seeing a similar thing when you're going to sell, kind of pushing on the coverage and explaining that specific issue as far as where the kind of liability may rest?
Yeah, it's become kind of a complex issue for the small businesses because they are outsourcing to the cloud providers, and regionally in San Francisco, more often than not, you're using a cloud provider. Everybody's sold on it. They understand the advantages of it, and they understand that it's easier to outsource it than to do it internally, both from a cost perspective and from an IT security perspective. But as brokers and underwriters, what we see in the negotiations when they have to buy insurance is, here's the insurance clause of the contract, and we're like, I need to see the contract, because the limitation of liability and the hold harmless agreements are really what you want to look at, and the cloud providers, for the most part, have the upper hand, and they limit their liability, and the small business or any business that outsources to the cloud really has limited rights within that contract. They don't know where their data is. They don't really have much power to audit or get that data from the cloud provider, and it makes it difficult. So it has become a complex part of the process, and then they also will discount their need for cyber because they outsource it.
Mm-hmm.
So we really say that, well, that's really one part of your supply chain, and look at it as a supply chain, not as your end all be all.
Yeah.
So.
And Glenn, just the final kind of point on that. Do you view that as would you rather see a small business managing their own IT or using a third party that kind of specializes in it?
It depends on that person in that industry, right? I feel that if you look at like the healthcare and I see a physician's practice, I don't want them managing their IT. I'd rather see that they're going to a tried and trusted, true kind of outsource provider where, those kiosks or those terminals, once those things they're logged out, there's no data. I don't have to worry about them losing a laptop or file. So I think it really depends on the industry as well. I think the vendors, especially the big ones, they can do what needs to be done. They can de-aggregate within the cloud and everything else. But the problem is, are they going to those larger vendors, or are they going to some small kind of unknown local shop that might disappear?
Yeah. And then kind of in a contrast, at a large organization, managing the risk and working with IT, do you guys face some of the similar challenges that they're touching on as far as using third parties?
Well, we're more middle market organization based on annualized revenue. We're a parent organization with 4 charitable subsidiaries and a political action committee. Last year's revenues were $436 million, so that's middle market. It's true that at a smaller entity, you won't have someone who calls himself the risk manager, but as RIMS, the Risk Management Society, always says, you have risk professionals within each line of business, including IT. They just don't call themselves risk managers, and your role is to identify the right people and bring them to the table. Now, in my case, it was a clear decision. We do not store membership data in the cloud, and we've stated that publicly.
Brian, if I could, just really quick from a legal perspective,
Yeah.
in the response side, when you talk about vendors, we're seeing a real increase in uptake in the breach happening at the vendor, and especially for small companies, when we tell them that the laws say, well, because you're the owner of the information, just because your IT vendor or your third-party document storage company had the breach, guess whose responsibility it is to send out 10,000 letters? You. The vendor just has to send one letter out. Now sometimes, there's agreements and contractual arrangements where the vendor will end up doing the notification, but so many times it's such a shock to a company that says, well, I didn't have the breach, I didn't do anything wrong, and unfortunately, it's their letterhead, it's got to go on.
Yeah.
It's a good point. I want to touch on that. It's something in the front end on the sale process that we have to reinforce constantly. It's like, well, we outsource our data. It's like, it doesn't matter. You still have to do it. And organizations don't really understand that. So that's a really key point about the education, about the coverage and the liability and the awareness of their exposures, that they don't realize that they have to notify. And they realize, you have to teach them that once they take the data, then they're responsible and they're liable. No matter what they do after that with the data or where it's housed or how it's breached, it does not matter.
And,
Yeah.
and just switching a little bit, it's not just about the data and privacy as well. You're a small business and you have data loss exposure. They were talking about crypto lockers today. I mean, these are all exposures and things that are covered on a good and cyber network security and privacy policy. So it's not just about privacy. So if they think that they don't touch a lot of consumers, a lot of personal identifiable information, if their database gets encrypted and they can't function, what are they going to do? Who are they going to access? And I think that's the other kind of benefit of the coverage and how you can go about selling it, why small business should be buying it, is that they're not going to go to like Jeremy at the on the 13th hour when they've had a breach and then try and get a contract or try and have them perform work, because you're not going to get a very good deal. And also, if you're going directly to a forensics firm, when you have a breach, you lose that client attorney privilege and confidentiality, which I'm sure you guys can talk about. But there's, it gets frustrating when you see people that are just trying to sell the price on it. You just want the cheapest thing, and then it becomes like, it's not an auto policy where you save 10%. You really have to look and hope you have that broad policy. And it is cheap, though.
15 minutes.
Dom, one of the things we were talking about earlier, and I think would be worthwhile touching on, is just some of the kind of war stories. I find them always interesting to hear from claims and just what they're seeing on the ground in the actual incident. But just that kind of comparison of what a smaller account is dealing with
Sure.
on these type of claims versus a larger account.
It's so different doing legal breach response for a Fortune 50 company versus a smaller entity. We do a lot of smaller colleges, healthcare practices. We had one a couple of months ago, and the trend we're really seeing is that they sort of come hat in hand and say, oh, well, we already sent these letters out. Okay, show them to me. Well, they're not compliant. They're not compliant with any of the state laws. They don't even know what personal information, how it is even defined anymore, because states are changing the definition of that. So they think, oh, well, it wasn't credit cards. It was just, names and dates of birth. Well, guess what? In some states, that's enough to trigger notification. So they just don't have the resources, as we've been talking. But we had one the other day that said, well, here is the letter that I sent out, talking about falling on your own sword and admitting liability. So they have something to the effect of, we accept full responsibility, and they use some quote of, and we'll pay for any harm that you incur, period. Period. If that wasn't bad enough,
As an
they
attorney,
then
did that make you
enclosed,
sick?
yeah, it's just, it becomes Exhibit A to either the class action lawsuit or the private action. And, the attorneys general are going to love to see a copy of that letter too. But if that wasn't bad enough, they enclosed a check for $150 written to the employee and said, this is for you to sign up for LifeLock or some other product. Well, God only knows. They probably went and bought, drinks for the whole office and everything, but they end up not buying the product. And, again, another source for liability for an action. You didn't provide me. Another thing we're seeing is that companies are so careful. We don't want to make it sound like a big deal, so we very soft pedal the letter. Well, again, great source of liability. Employee or customer says, well, you told me I had nothing to worry about, so I didn't do anything. I didn't take the steps. Again, source of liability.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things you kind of touched on in our conversations was the difference between a large organization and dealing with that claim versus a smaller one, and kind of how they want to use you and kind of hand it off versus a larger organization.
Yeah, ideally, I'm sure Jeremy can talk too. You know, ideally, yeah, as the breach response coach and attorney, you get called within 48 hours. Especially with smaller companies, you know, it's like 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, as all the deadlines are, you know, well past. But, you know, it's real different working with a Fortune 50 company. They're very, you know, they have their incident response plan. Sometimes it's not very good, but they have a plan. We all have board meetings, you know, every hour, and everyone has to look at every comma and hyphen and, you know, semicolon. You have the smaller companies that, you know, either A, don't want to incur the legal expense, so they end up sending out the letters themselves and, you know, suffer the liability that way. But if they do allow us to kind of take control, it really can go smooth. You know, because you don't have the sort of bureaucratic flap up and down the flagpole that you have to run things through.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we've seen more specifically in this smaller business is, I thought of it with some of the other comments that are being made around the IT systems and how they're being set up. And you know, at some level, there's a point where they go to a credible, you know, outside vendor that can do it the right way. But a lot of small businesses go with their uncle or their brother or their nephew that helps them set up the system. And in so many cases, we find that you know, they know something happened because they're probably told by their client, or a customer comes and says, I've been breached, here's what I see online, what's going on. And then they'll call us and say, help. And we'll start to try to gather the evidence to help them figure out what's actually going on here. How did they break in? What happened here? And more often than not, there's hardly any evidence to show exactly how long this has been happening. And it's usually because they just hadn't turned on the features of their technology to provide logs to go and do an investigation. So then you're left with a situation where it's kind of a, well, how much was on that system? And let's, you know, that's about as much as we can slim it down, was that system over there. And we see that half the time with small entity breaches.
Yeah.
Sorry, was that not?
Yeah, trying to recreate those logs. The smaller companies just don't have logs that, you know, say, indicate whose information was on that, you know, device. So we know we have a lost device, or we know we have a breach device, but who do we notify?
Right. And then you get into the situation where you start to make those notifications, whether you're the business associate telling your client or the client telling your customers. You can't really explain it. And so
Right.
you get to those points he was talking about in the letter of describing what happened and trying to answer those tough questions. You can't do it.
We had one smaller company in the wake of Target. We were really seeing everyone that just wants to get the word out, right? Because everyone really came down on Target. And so we had one smaller healthcare entity that decided to just go right to the media, have a press conference with our local ABC, NBC, and Fox affiliates. They're a big player in, I guess, in our local area, but smaller company. And it was just it was a stolen laptop. The car was stolen. Laptop was in the car. Car was stolen. They go out, okay, we had a breach. It affects everybody, the whole patient base. Car is found the next day. They ran forensics because the laptop was still underneath the seat. Ran forensics, and laptop had never been turned on. So that's a incident where you really do need to take the steps sometimes, and these statutes allow for you to. There's some delay. They contemplate that and they understand it. But like I said, in the wake of Target, everyone just wants to get the word out. And half the time I'm like, well, what do you want me to say? We don't know anything. So you're going to get a word, you want to go to the press, you want to get it out, but you have nothing to say.
Yeah. And just to switch gears a little bit, Steve, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but I'd be curious just for the point of discussion, just to talk a little bit about the biggest challenges you're seeing on the sales front, whether you're having to push this coverage or in the wake of some of the kind of larger breaches in the news, whether people are more coming to you for it.
Yeah, it's a good question because, and to take away from a bit of the follies here that we're talking about, like where people have messed that up, where I encourage in the sales process is use this app, use us selling you this as the education itself. The whole buying cyber liability can be an education in, well, I don't have a business continuity plan. Well, I don't have a disaster recovery plan. Oh wait, I should be encrypting data. So it's a challenge up front in the education, but I find that the more you educate them, the more they're an informed buyer. And then each year, they're a little bit better down the line on it. But as a wholesale broker, you know, I'm in between too. I'm in between Glenn and then there's usually another retail broker. So it's kind of the phone game, you know, as the information trickles down from the insured to the carrier, it gets, you know, watered down. And then as they quote, it gets watered down between, you know, all the brokers to them. So there's a lot of, you know, surmising, guessing about where they're going to get coverage and not a lot of continuity in the process. So what we try to encourage is if I can get in front of that client as much as possible on a conference call or getting in front of them, you know, then it's more beneficial. And educating the retail brokers is really a crucial element. You know, anybody that's a risk manager in here or works at a small business, the retail broker is on the front line for them. They're their educational piece, and a lot of time they're the first one to know about the breach. And they take cues and will learn from the process from their retail broker. So it falls on the retail broker a lot to let them know the resources that are available in the policy, you know, steps that they should take when they have a claim, and things that they should be doing up front in the process to help mitigate their risk. And a lot of times the retail broker doesn't do that because they're not educated about cyber, just like the insured. So, you know, educating, again, and awareness, it's a key theme here. You know, you can't get the buyer to value the coverage without them knowing what's in it. So you have to explain it to them, you know, bit by bit and not in a complex fashion, which can be difficult because it's cyber liability and it's insurance. So it's not exactly, you know, an exciting topic for people. So getting, you know, putting it in layman's terms and showing it how it affects their balance sheet and their day-to-day business is really crucial.
I think, Jeremy, I think you had mentioned something about like 60% of small middle market businesses that suffer significant breach are closing their doors after it happens. You know, if they can't respond to it properly, then they're dead in the water. And I think one of the most important things that on the carrier side that we're looking at right now to differentiate ourselves is not just the post-breach responses, because most companies should be having that kind of breach codes and that process that the client can access, and that the broker says, oh, you had something, call this number, get you 800 number of breach codes, and the wheels start rolling. But the other thing that we're trying to look into differentiate ourselves at is those pre-breach. You know, you have a small middle market company, you don't have the resources to have HR in there and to deploy these things. So if you can print out a sheet to put in the break room that just reminds you about locking your laptop or passwords or something like that, it'll get into their head, and it creates what they were talking about this morning again, and what we're talking about here as well is awareness. A lot of companies have, you know, in-a-box type of webinars that they can email. You can watch it. I'm sure everybody at a company here has watched those ones or taken one for HR that talks about employment practice and how to treat your coworkers. Companies have those now for privacy and for security. And I think if you use that in the sales side, it really helps getting that small business to spend, you know, to think about it and to spend, you know, I mean, there are policies that you can get for, you know, $1,500. So it's really not a lot of money when you think about the small business side, and there's a lot of resources at their fingertips.
I think that's worth expanding on, because that might be a suggestion for the carriers to do. Like with every EPLI policy, you get your HR webinar, and it's some law firm that does it for you, and they contract with the carrier. If at minimum they were doing some small webinar on, you know, password protection and, you know, thumb drives and using your bring your own device, it would decrease the amount of incidents probably dramatically, because you see all the stats, and I'm sure you'll see a lot more throughout this conference, that how much breaches, incidents, whatever they may be, happen from just employee negligence. So just small amount of risk management up front will mean a lot.
Yeah. And I can tell you from the regulator investigation standpoint, the number one item they look for, OCR, State Attorneys General, what are you doing for training? You know, everyone's so prepared. We'll get into AG will come in, and everyone wants to talk about the breach. They're prepared about the breach. And first question, they'll say, show us your training and all your attendance logs for all your webinars. And they're like, you know, so that's what they're looking for. You know, how can your organization prevent this from happening again? That's what the state regulators and OCR are really paying attention to.
It really should be in the employment handbook, and a lot of times it is, but it's buried somewhere in there, and it's not talked about. And that's why, you know, from a risk management perspective, if everybody in the company knows about the risks associated with this, it'll be explained and it'll be talked about. And if at minimum that's done, it'll help out.
And I think, Jeremy, there was a couple things that we had talked about as far as some of the kind of cost-effective tools available to small business for some of these protections, whether it be encryption or otherwise, but if you could touch on a couple of those things.
Yeah, so there's, like he's mentioning there, the webinars and attendance logs. You're going to get asked about those if you have a breach, and if you don't have it, then you're kind of a deer in the headlights all of a sudden. And so the webinars, and a lot of us put that information together, and they're great, but there's also other low-cost, online training programs that also have lots of tracking features, so you can push it out to the employees, and they can get the security training they need. And it can be in bite-sized pieces. It doesn't necessarily need to be that hour-long training you do once a year, forget most of it about a week later, and then make a mistake and cause a data breach. So that's one of the issues that is not an expensive thing to solve for a small company, but they just don't do it. There's so much other stuff coming at them, and they don't see the value of it until they have a breach. Ideally they would, but it's difficult for them to connect those dots. The other, Dom, you might see this as well, is the other question you often get is, show me your policies and procedures, show me the last time you updated them, show me how you manage them, and they look at the shelf and it's still in like the wrapper from when they bought it, and there's a CD, it's that old, it like was on a CD, they would send it out that way.
Yeah.
And well, so that's not good either. They haven't touched it, they haven't been training specifically on those, they haven't maybe customized them to their own organization. And again, there's technology solutions out there now that make the small entity, it fits well for them. It doesn't work as well for a large company that needs to really spend a lot of time and effort customizing them to their own business needs. But a lot of, maybe even middle market, but certainly small entities can use this stuff, and it's not expensive and will do them a ton of favors when they start getting asked the hard questions.
And the trend now, the regulators are getting smarter. When they ask for your policies, they're asking you for the policies that were in place at the time of the breach. Because what was happening, right? You get the data request and you have 14 days to return all your documents. And so there's a mad scramble to start producing, incident response plans, written information security programs, and all the health HIPAA policies. So again, now they're asking, provide us the policies that were in place at the time of the breach, and also provide us those that have been updated as a result of the breach. So they're getting smarter.
Yeah. And what are you seeing as far as just kind of like regulatory side of things with claims specific kind of small business versus the larger?
Yeah, the state AGs are really, one of the problems is, especially when they do it themselves, they're not notifying these state AGs. That'll tick them off the most, and the delay. There are certain states, like Indiana, you will never see 30 days in their statute. Having worked with the Indiana AG, I know that when they say provide notice within a reasonable amount of time, that means 30 days. You provide notice on 31 days, they're going to say, why did you delay? So I think smaller entities, again, not using the resources that they don't even know they have available to them. When you're not using privacy counsel, breach coaches, vendors, they're making those mistakes. And I think that's costing them. OCR, if there's 500 or more, there's an automatic investigation. So 500 or more PHI records, their new thing, they are sending you out an audit letter. And if you don't comply and don't respond promptly, they will be at your door knocking. Really seen within the last 3 weeks, 5 of my clients that had breaches, all 5 of them got letters from the various, and it's not just a certain regional office. OCR, they're on a major hiring spree, and they're just hiring investigators. Every OCR investigation is a different investigator that I work with, so they're definitely on, and they don't care. They don't care if you're a small organization.
And when they're coming out, they may ask questions about your security and your technology, and they want to know the basics, like you were encrypting or were you not, but they care about compliance and who's your privacy officer, and show me the documentation of all these things that we're talking about. And if you can show that to them, it's going to be a more difficult case for them to come find you, and they got other doors they can go knock on that are just down the street usually. So the more prepared you can be with that compliance stuff really helps you in those situations.
Sure, timing, and then just a lack of having the policies. Those two things will really, as Mark said, or someone said in the previous session, it's not the number of records. It's really kind of what you did and what you're doing as a result of the breach.
Gotcha. Just to take 1 second, I just wanted to see if there were any questions specific to anything that's either been said, or just specific to kind of small cyber, just because we're getting towards the end of the time, and I want to make sure if there's specific questions, we touch on them.
Yeah, I wonder if, the way with EPLI, there are certain states that are known as, hey, be careful out there,
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that would probably be for
I mean,
both of you.
I think there's always those litigation hellholes, right, that we always want to stay away from on the other side. And I think every off-site meeting that we have, our claims manager will kind of show you that. I think for us, what you have to do is identify those states that have more stringent and more significant laws. And Massachusetts is one of them. It doesn't mean that we're not right in Massachusetts. We have to identify it. I think Minnesota just came out with something new that they're trying to push back on the retailers as well.
Yeah, they codify the PCI, so it's
Yeah.
law there,
Which is, so it's really everybody, the most difficult thing again is that every single state has its different requirement. And this is just the thing about privacy and how they're addressing the privacy. So it really gets to the point is that you just got to underwrite the risk itself, and awareness of the company is really the most important thing. We haven't looked at anything yet and said we're absolutely staying out of that state because of those laws. But
Yeah, I don't think the underwriters and brokers are really looking at the jurisdictions of their insureds. It's really the claims handling people at the carriers. And you can kind of hear them griping about insureds at the, it's a pretty funny way to kick off the conference, but, anyways. There's absolutely no shortage of capacity, right? It's the most sought after insurance policy to write right now, because it's new and the loss ratios on a whole are pretty smaller. It's going to change over time, but you'll probably run into 50 to 60 carriers in here that will insure, and especially small business, because they are targeting small business cyber liability as a growth area for them to grow in insurance. And you'll see every conference, whether it's insurance conference or a cyber conference, they all are targeting the small business. So from a jurisdictional perspective, it's not really an issue, but from the claims perspective, it is. But that's not really for us to worry about. That's for the claims and these guys to worry about.
And one reason you're hearing them say that they're really not staying out of jurisdictions, when you have a breach, the law that governs is the law of the residency of the affected individual. So you could be
Yeah.
located in Massachusetts, but you have records from all 50 states. So that's why it's really hard to say, oh, you're in Massachusetts, so you're only going to have to comply with that law.
Yeah. And you don't know where that claim's going to come from.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's what's really hard to restrict by jurisdiction.
That's a good question.
Curious as to what your viewpoint is. You talk a lot about how the smaller businesses have a lack of controls and procedures in place. I guess, in your view, are the underwriters properly assessing the risks of, relatively very small businesses relative to slightly larger businesses? I guess, is, in your view, the pricing, properly associated with that risk, or is there kind of a disconnect there?
I mean, I think there's a big disconnect to a degree. Right now, with the small business, it's law of large numbers. I mean, there's so much capacity out there and so much competition that, I'll go to one of my colleagues and I'll say, look at this app I have, or there's no information. This was bound and this was quoted and bound, and you scratch your head. It's a retailer, 3 stores, and the app had no questions on their point of sale management. I don't understand that. So I think there is a disconnect on it, but what they're looking at it is that, we'll keep the limits low, let's write as much as we possibly can, and let's spread it out. And they treat it almost like, program underwriting to some degree. So eventually that's going to come to a headway where either the coverage is just going to not vanish, but it's just going to price accordingly by the industry, or we're going to have to get that information in there. If I waited to get a conference call and to get like a 20-page application completed, I wouldn't be able to quote anything in this marketplace. And seeing how it's developed and where it goes, it's kind of frustrating without a doubt. So, like I was saying earlier, as an underwriter, you got to redefine how you typically look at the risk and understand it, and really segment it by industry and zero in on what you really want to know. Which again pushes to, if you're trying to sell it to the small business and they're reluctant, or they say they have it in on their D&O or one other policy. If I was a director or officer, I wouldn't want, or if I was a doctor, I wouldn't want my professional liability or my D&O policy being chewed up because of a breach. Because then when I get sued, I'm not going to have anything to protect me at that point. So, it's still very evolving. I mean, it's been out there for over 10 years, the coverage, and it seems like it changes or evolves every year to some degree.
Yeah, I think there's obviously a complete disconnect between small business underwriting and large, underwriting and on the large, it's a slow process. There's conference calls, there's audits, there's, complete apps, and there's supplements. In small business, it's a quick app, and it's a short cycle, and it's quote to bind. And it's really advantageous for the small businesses, because you can have lack of processes and systems and encryption and policies and procedures, but yet you can still get a lot of limit for a very low premium. So enjoy it while you can, because I think over time it's going to evolve where the assessments and the apps are going to get better at assessing your risk and your exposure and making recommendations pre-binding and follow up post-binding. Is right now it's just like, well, what's your revenues, what's your class of business, here's your quote, here's lots of limits, fine, you know, and it's really advantageous for the small businesses right now.
And going from what Emily had said earlier, you know, if you get them to buy now when it's cheap and it's broad, they establish that relationship with the carrier, but you can also push them towards utilizing those resources. So if you go on like the E-Risk Hub and that Diligence has, I mean, there's incident response plans in there.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that you can download and put there. So you're hoping if you're doing a small business, it's easily managed if they have awareness. But if they're totally reluctant to even adopt any type of responsibility for the privacy or their network or their computers, then, you know, you're going to get that claim regardless.
Get in now, though. It's a good time to buy.
That's right.
Because it's going to get a little bit more onerous of an underwriting process, and it's going to get a little bit more expensive. And as they have more information to underwrite on the losses, the deductibles and the SIRs will go higher.
I think is there much receptiveness in the small business space to doing some basic practices to mitigate the risk, or is it really not there right now?
I think they're always interested, but they don't want to pay
Right.
for any of it. So they know that there's issues, but they want to know what's free. And so the more you can build into the insurance policy to help them lower their risk, because like they're saying, you're just signing up whoever wants to buy it right now. And so there needs to, over time, be more of an effort to help them actually bring that risk down by, you know, providing some of these tools that are low cost and affordable, and, you know, in some cases can be actually built into the policy.
Yeah, that was a good question. Was that another in the?
Yeah, Ron, I have a question. So, Beverly report 2010 showed there were 10 primary cyber markets.
Mm-hmm.
2014 is going to be now with roughly 28 primary cyber markets. I think Peter Foster said there were 50. And Bison said there were 50. I don't know if they think globally or primary. But why are, you know, my thoughts are that the underwriting process won't become more onerous. How does the panel sort of feel about that?
It's a little supply and demand type thing.
Correct.
Yeah.
That it won't become?
Yeah.
No, well, that's exactly, I mean, right now it's not, everything's pointing to it's not, but if those claims really start coming in and people are cutting checks, at some point you have to look at it, and I forget, somebody had said earlier, you know, you'll see an underwriter that doesn't touch healthcare anymore because they've gotten slammed in healthcare. So in that respect, all of a sudden, where you had 20 markets, you might now have 15 markets. So there are different classes where you'll see that's going to dictate what the underwriting process is. But, you know, at this point in time, I mean, it seems like there's a new market or a new capacity popping up, you know, every week. So it's going to take some time. I mean, I think we thought it was going to get harder. We're going to be able to get more information 5 years ago, and that really didn't happen. But I think on a larger, more complex risk, it is happening, because you're getting actual conference calls that are geared towards, you know, the network security and the privacy, you know, just like they do for the D&O or for the professional liability. So it started up there where you used to not get that. So eventually, at some point, you'll get like a really true quality application.
It'll be interesting to see how it evolves. You know, right now, you can send a new business submission out on a small company, and you send it to 15 markets, you get 15 quotes. You know, you send it to 25 markets, you get 25 quotes. So nobody declines, right? So the underwriting process, again, I think it's really easy right now. We'll see if it gets easier or if it gets harder as claims come in and as, you know, the actuaries get the claim data. But, you know, that's one difficult part of the sale process in general, is that you get 15 quotes with 15 different limits and 15 different sub-limits and 15 different, you know, InfoSec, secure, private, you know, these different names. It's a very confusing structure of the policy. So I think that the policy, a little more uniformity, maybe for the smaller business, will actually help it.
We are on underwriting, so what he's saying is that the underwriters are underwriting. I talk to them, and we get frustrated by, you know, the 3-page applications or just the website. The fact is we have to, you know, to get that information at times, you have to zero in on exactly what you want. You know, don't just ask questions, ask questions. Ask if they have a privacy policy and say, yeah, are you sure I have a privacy policy? you know, unless you're gonna get it or see it or they actually follow it, it's a pointless type question to some degree. So you really have to zero in on what you want.
There's another question?
Just sort of in the same vein, you talked a little bit about companies that you think might be getting out of certain areas of practice. And I wondered if you could speak to just the sort of mentality that it's the number of records that you're holding rather than the class of business that you're in. Do you see that sort of eclipsing the sort of class of business as a risk? You know, basically if you're only holding 100 records versus you're holding, 10 million records, what kind of weight does that hold right now, and where do you kind of see that going?
I think it's a combination of the two. It's your class of business and your number of records. And a lot of times they've characterized classes of business as being better or worse at handling breaches and encrypting data. I hate to zero in on it, but debt collectors and debt buyers have a huge amount of information, but they spend little to no money protecting that because they don't care. They just want to collect on the debt because it's a way to monetize. So there's certain industries that will not spend money on that. But healthcare, I think, is zeroed in. They have a lot of information, but yet they have a lot of regulatory compliance and a lot of restriction that it's pushed them to be proactive about it.
I mean, but at the end of the day, it is, what you're saying is like, you have a client that has 10 million records, that exposure is gonna be a limited loss if something happens, if it's sloppy. So,
Yeah.
Everybody has their own way, every company has their own kind of fears of it. The biggest thing, if you're talking to any reinsurers, they're scared to death about that whole aggregation issue. So I do think records is extremely important when you're selecting the risk, and if you're talking about a small business, that's a staffing firm. And, the quote that they have is for like $5,000 or $7,000 for like $1 million limit. You forget that a staffing firm has how many records on file? How many people have gone through them, filled out that information? So while you think they might not be that like a target, they have a lot of data in there, and that might be one that I wouldn't want to quote at that type of price.
Yeah, and it does seem to be, I would say, the larger it is, the bigger that number is. That's when you get the follow-up questions before you'll get the quote. But on the smaller ones, it seems to be a kind of almost a blind quoting process to a degree.
Yeah.
But that's a good question.
I see policy apps asking very good substantive questions, really getting to the heart of the matter, and it's evolved over the past 7 years that I've looked at various policy apps. The idea of being onerous, it's interesting. Think about it's onerous on the underwriter when they receive hundreds of pages that they are expected to slog through. Isn't it more efficient for the underwriter to receive what matters, the essence? For example, don't give me 200 pages of a policy, give me the 5 pages directly relevant to the question I'm asking. And that helps us on the side of presenting our risks, presenting our exposures. Let's drill down into exactly what matters so that this is what an insurance contract is a meeting of the minds, so that we're presenting exposures and we're expecting certain losses to be covered, right? So as you have that meeting of the minds, you have awareness of, these are my exposures and here's why I'm buying insurance. We're actually, as an industry, much better off now than we were at the beginning. Apps are getting better.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm just wondering, there's a lot of products out there that are geared towards the small businesses where there's specifically a business model with no underwriting questions, and here's $25,000 or $50,000 worth of breach coverage. And my question about that is that really doing and their services attached to it, or is that really doing a job for a small business? Is that a service to a small business, or is that giving them maybe a sense of security that isn't warranted because it's not supplemental?
Yeah, and just to make sure I'm clear, are you talking about like a supplement on another type of policy where they're giving a little add-on of cyber versus the dedicated?
Sometimes it's a separate standalone coverage with just the small limit. It's not a supplement, but it's just a small limit.
Yeah, I think,
I mean, I would ask Dom and Jeremy how quickly that gets.
But you saw Mark's stats, and one thing, he did point out, it's worth reiterating, it doesn't matter, again, how small. I have had breaches where I have 100 people, but they're in all 50 states, and so you're doing the same sort of process, whether it's for 500,000 records or for 1,000 records. You still have to go through the, state analysis, the notification process, the forensics. So there's a lot of fixed costs, and certainly that would get eaten up
Yeah.
quick layout.
And a lot of these, like we were talking about earlier, the technical or IT issues, sometimes they end up being more expensive forensic cases because we have to try so much harder to find any evidence to point to what actually happened. So, there's often cases where it's a small business and it might only be 1,000 records, but it's more time consuming to ultimately get to some conclusion about what actually happened because we have to spend a lot more time looking around for the evidence.
And I think what's important to kind of keep in mind as well, in this area, you're guilty before you're innocent. So if you lose a laptop or something, you have to prove to the AG or whomever that was encrypted. They couldn't recreate the data. So that car that got stolen, they spoke about earlier, if they didn't find the car, they would have to assume that data was exposed unless they could somehow back end and see what was downloaded on that laptop. And then you're talking about a forensics nightmare. So it doesn't matter, if you had 1 million notification, if your policy log for, you could notify 500,000 people, because it's not going to hit it until you really spent the forensics costs on a lawyer. Because
One of the other issues that we've seen with those kinds of policies is when you get to a $50,000 limit and it's a $67,000 issue altogether, they have a really hard time writing that $17,000 check, even though they didn't have to pay for 50 of that. And so it puts us often in a position where we're having to explain to them why this costs what it does, and,
Right.
and they're almost mad at us because it costs what it does, and really it's, someone else sold them something that wasn't enough.
And then, of course, when they get the AG letter 3 months later, there go all their coverage, so
Yeah, and I think just
they have
in
no
addition,
dollars for that.
in addition to that, I could say the IT forensics are a big focus in that case, and then a lot of times the forensics can be the biggest cost, not necessarily the liability. So often, I see that a lot, and I usually recommend a bigger limit even for a much smaller company, even if they have limited data, because often, as we said earlier, you can usually get $1 million limit for $1,000 for a very small account, a very small business, and so it's worth getting the coverage from that standpoint.
Isn't that the third-party limit, $2 million?
Well, there's,
you can get across the board now.
you can get a lot with
You-
$1 million
you
with
get-
all those sublimits up to $1 million.
Yeah, you can get, notification, crisis management, extortion, you can get all that at full limits.
Yeah. Specific to small business, the larger business, that might not necessarily be the case as far as that blanket giving.
Is there a requirement for your customers to have a baseline risk assessment? And would that help reduce the insurance costs?
It always,
Yes.
For HIPAA compliance.
So is it the company pick somebody to do the assessment, or do you are you partnering with specific companies in the industry to do that for you?
It should be part of the risk management process, but again, small to mid-sized businesses don't make it part of their risk management process. So I think you'll see the insurance industry evolve to do more risk assessments pre-binding and in the underwriting, which is good.
And I've seen brokerage firms utilize like Mark Reitziger and that diligence's firm to kind of zero in and have that conference go and have like an underwriting assessment, so to speak.
Yeah, it seems to be more typical for the much larger accounts than the small accounts.